If you're new here, welcome. Subscribe. Join us on this journey backward through time. The morning began in silence. In a small stone house in Nazareth, or perhaps Capernaum, or a nameless village in the Galilee, a young couple woke as pale light filtered through a narrow window. The air smelled of dried clay and smoke from the previous night's fire. A simple mat of woven reeds lay beneath them, a woolen blanket, rough against the skin. The husband rose first. His tunic hung on a wooden peg. The wife remained still for a moment, her hand resting on her belly. She was 20. She had been married for 3 years. She had already given birth twice. One child survived, the other did not. This was the rhythm of life in first-century Judea. Marriage came early, often at 14 or 15 for girls, slightly older for boys. And once married, intimacy was expected, not as recreation, not as choice, but as duty, the continuation of the family, the securing of the household, the fulfillment of covenant obligations stretching back to Abraham. But what happened inside these small stone rooms, between husband and wife in the quiet hours after sunset, was governed entirely by nature. There was no prevention, no planning, no separation between the act of intimacy and the consequence of new life. The body decided, and the body did not ask permission. For women, this meant something very specific. Pregnancy was not a possibility. It was an inevitability. A young bride could expect to conceive within months of marriage. If she survived childbirth, she would conceive again, and again, as long as her body allowed. The cycle was relentless. Fertility was measured not in years, but in pregnancies. Some women bore 10 children, 12, 15, many did not survive them all. The tombs outside Jerusalem hold the bones of mothers who died in labor, their infants beside them. The ancient world had no understanding of ovulation, no knowledge of the menstrual cycle beyond the visible blood that marked a woman as ritually impure under Jewish law. Leviticus commanded separation during menstruation, 7 days of distance, no physical contact. But this was not contraception. It was purification, a religious boundary, not a biological one. And once those 7 days ended, intimacy resumed. The rhythm continued. The womb opened again to the possibility, the probability, of conception. There were whispers, of course, knowledge passed from mothers to daughters in low voices, herbal remedies, mixtures of crushed seeds, acacia leaves, honey. Some believed that certain plants consumed after intimacy could prevent conception. Silphium, a now extinct plant from North Africa, was rumored to have such power. But these remedies were unreliable, superstition mixed with hope. Most did nothing, and even if they worked occasionally, they were inaccessible to ordinary women in rural Judea. The wife of a fisherman in Capernaum had no access to rare imported plants. She had what grew nearby, and what grew nearby offered little protection. Some couples practiced withdrawal. The Torah itself references this indirectly in the story of Onan, who spilled his seed on the ground to avoid giving his brother's widow a child. The text condemns him, not for the act itself, but for refusing his duty. Still, the story survived, and survival in Scripture meant knowledge. Some men knew, some attempted it, but it required discipline, restraint, control in moments when control was fleeting, and even then it often failed. For most, intimacy and fertility were inseparable. To be married was to accept this. To lie with one's husband was to risk or invite new life. There was no middle ground. The body did not negotiate. But the cost of this reality fell unequally. For men, intimacy carried social expectation, but little physical risk. A husband could father many children and his body would not change. He would not labor for hours in pain. He would not bleed. He would not face the possibility of death each time a child was conceived. For women, every act of intimacy carried weight. Every month without blood brought both relief and dread. Relief if another pregnancy was unwanted. Dread if it meant yet another birth in a world where childbirth was the leading cause of death for women of childbearing age. The midwives knew this. They had seen it countless times. A young mother, healthy and strong, dead within hours of delivery from bleeding that would not stop, or fever that came days later, burning through her body as infection spread. There were no antibiotics, no surgical interventions, only prayer. And prayer, however fervent, could not stop hemorrhage. This inequality was structural, woven into the fabric of ancient life. A man's role in procreation ended in moments. A woman's role extended for years. 9 months of pregnancy, months or years of nursing, the physical recovery that was never truly complete before the next pregnancy began. Her body was not entirely her own. It belonged to the family, to the household, to the continuation of the line. The covenant required children, and the covenant was not optional. The rabbis debated the nature of marital duty. How often must a husband fulfill his obligations to his wife? The Mishnah, compiled in the centuries after Jesus, records these discussions. For a man of leisure, twice a week. For a laborer once, for a sailor once every 6 months. These were minimums, not maximums. And they were framed as the husband's duty to the wife, not as mutual desire but as obligation. The language reveals everything. Intimacy was structured, regulated, expected, and beyond human expectation, there were divine commands. The Torah instructed, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth." This was not merely suggestion. It was the first commandment given to humanity in Genesis. To refuse it, to deliberately prevent conception, was to refuse God's design, or so it was taught. Jewish law made space for intimacy beyond procreation. The Song of Solomon celebrates erotic love. The sages acknowledged that intimacy strengthened the bond between husband and wife, but even this was contained within marriage. Outside marriage, intimacy was forbidden, punishable. A woman found in adultery could be stoned. A man who seduced a virgin owed her father compensation and was required to marry her. The body was never free. It was always accountable to family, to community, to God. Living in this world meant navigating invisible boundaries. A woman's menstrual blood made her ritually impure. Physical contact during this time was forbidden. Even sitting where she had sat required purification. After the bleeding stopped, she counted 7 clean days. Then she immersed in a mikveh, a ritual bath, before resuming physical intimacy with her husband. This cycle repeated monthly. It was not birth control, but it was rhythm, a pattern that briefly interrupted the otherwise relentless possibility of conception. For some women, this was the only pause they knew. 7 days of rest, 7 days when their bodies were their own, and then the immersion, the return, the door opening once again to pregnancy. What all of this reveals is not scandal, it is survival. In a world without hospitals, without infant formula, without reliable food supply, children were both blessing and burden. A large family meant more hands to work the fields, more security in old age, but it also meant more mouths to feed, more bodies to clothe, more grief when fever or famine came. Intimacy without contraception was not freedom. It was risk. Calculated or not, it was the reality every married couple lived. The wife who woke in that stone house in Nazareth, her hand on her belly, knew this. She did not choose how many children to bear. She bore as many as her body allowed, until it couldn't anymore, until childbirth took her, or until age and exhaustion made conception impossible. This was intimacy in the time of Jesus. Not romance, not choice, but the raw mechanics of survival in a world that offered no alternative. The body governed, nature decided. And the consequences, life, death, family, loss, unfolded without permission. 2,000 years later, we look back and see absence. Absence of control, absence of agency, absence of the simple power to decide when or whether to bring a child into the world. And perhaps that absence, more than anything else, reveals what it meant to live in the ancient world, not as autonomous individuals, but as bodies bound to forces larger than themselves, to family, to tradition, to God, to the relentless, ungovernable rhythm of nature itself. The Gospels themselves are silent on this reality. Jesus spoke of marriage, of divorce, of purity and adultery, but he never addressed the intimate mechanics of married life. He never mentioned pregnancy or fertility or the burden women carried. This silence is telling, not because the topic was taboo, but because it was so universally understood that it needed no explanation. Every listener knew, every woman in the crowd had lived it. When Jesus spoke to the crowds in Galilee, he was speaking to mothers who had buried children, to wives who feared the next pregnancy, to men who had watched their partners fade after too many births. The absence of commentary was not evasion, it was acknowledgement that this was simply how life worked. Yet within this harsh system, small acts of compassion sometimes emerged. Some husbands, observing their wives weakened by repeated pregnancies, might have practiced restraint, not from religious obligation but from love, from the recognition that another child might mean losing the woman who held the household together. There are no records of these quiet decisions, no chronicles of the farmer who chose to spare his wife, but human nature suggests they existed. In the margins of duty and tradition, tenderness found narrow space. A husband who brought water without being asked, who carried the grain sacks himself, who did not demand what the law allowed him to demand. These mercies left no trace in history, but they were real, and for the women who received them, they were everything. And so we arrive at the central truth of intimate life in ancient Judea. It was never truly private. Every aspect, from the timing of intimacy to the number of children born, was embedded in a web of social, religious, and economic forces that extended far beyond the small stone rooms where couples lay together. The woman's body was a site of contested meaning. It was the vessel of lineage, the guarantor of inheritance, the battleground where survival and faith intersected. And the man, for all his relative freedom, was also constrained by expectation, by duty, by the weight of providing for children he had not chosen to prevent. In this world, intimacy was not liberation. It was another form of labor, necessary, unending, and measured not in pleasure but in consequence.